Hey everyone, today we're diving into Matthew 24. Now, a lot of people see these verses as some kind of mysterious prophecy about the far-off future. But what if we look at it through the lens of history? It starts to look a lot less like a riddle and a lot more like, well, a literal survival guide for the very first Christians. So where does this all kick off? Well, it's not with some invading army or external threat. Nope. Verse 12 tells us it starts from the inside. It paints this picture of a society just falling apart. Iniquity shall abound, and the love of many shall wax cold. That kind of social and spiritual decay, that's what set the grim stage for the physical destruction that was just around the corner.
Okay, so right inside this warning, there were two really important conditions. Two things that had to happen before everything went down. And if you were an early Christian paying attention, these weren't just signs. They were basically a promise and a final countdown, all rolled into one. So let's take a look at that first condition. And that brings us to this huge promise in verse 13. He that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The sources we're looking at make it super clear that saved here doesn't mean what we might think. It wasn't about spiritual salvation or the end of the world. It was a promise of physical survival, literally being rescued from the destruction of Jerusalem that was coming between 66 and 70 AD. Now, this is a really important distinction to make. You got to remember, the disciples actually asked two different questions. One was about the temple being destroyed, and the other was about the end of the world. The sources point out that the end being talked about right here in this context, it's not the end of all time. It's the end of the Jewish nation as they knew it, which all came to a head in 70 AD. So what was the second condition? Well, verse 14 says the gospel had to be preached in all the world. And you might be thinking, how could that possibly have happened back then? Well, the sources argue it actually did, on the day of Pentecost. If you look at the book of Acts, it describes Jews from every nation hearing the message in Jerusalem. And what did they do? They carried it back home with them, basically spreading it all across the known Roman world. All right, now we get to the real pivot point of this whole warning. This wasn't some vague feeling or a general sense of doom. No, this was a specific, tangible thing you could see with your own eyes, the abomination of desolation. This was the final trigger, the signal that meant it's time to go now. That phrase right there in verse 15, that's the absolute key to unlocking this. And the sources really hammer this home. This was not a sign for some far-flung future generation. It was a historical event that the people living right then were supposed to see for themselves. So the big question is, what exactly was this abomination of desolation?
And check this out. The Gospel of Luke gives us a super clear, non-symbolic clue. In Luke 21:20, it basically spells it out. The desolation is tied directly to a military event you could see, Jerusalem compassed with armies. So that was the big external sign to be on the lookout for. Okay, so if the Roman armies surrounding the city was the sign of the desolation, then what was the abomination? The thing that would literally stand in the holy place? Well, you'll be amazed. The historical records are incredibly specific about this. See, what's fascinating is that the sources argue the abomination wasn't the Romans trashing the temple. That happened, but it was later. The first abomination to stand in the holy place was actually an inside job. It was committed by Jewish zealot factions who took over the temple and profaned it themselves by turning it into a fortress. And we actually have historical proof of this. The famous first-century historian Josephus, he cited in Ellicott's commentary, he wrote all about it. He recorded how these zealot factions stormed the temple, committed horrible acts right inside its walls, put their own corrupt priests in charge, and completely stopped the daily sacrifices. They literally turned a house of worship into a military garrison. So let's put it together. Once that two-part sign was visible, you've got the Roman armies outside the walls and this horrific profanity happening inside the temple. The instructions were crystal clear. Don't fight. Don't pray for a miracle. Don't hide. The command was to run, to flee with an urgency that's hard for us to even imagine. I mean, just listen to how direct verses 16 through 18 are. If you were on your housetop, you don't even go back down to grab your stuff. If you were out in the field, you don't even run back for your coat. Think about that. There was absolutely zero time to waste. That window of opportunity to escape, it was about to slam shut forever. And this is where history gets weird, in a way that made this whole escape possible. In 66 AD, the Roman general Cestius Gallus shows up and surrounds Jerusalem. The sign is there, just as predicted.
But then, for no reason historians can figure out, he just packs up and leaves. The Benson commentary points out that this totally inexplicable retreat created this perfect, almost miraculous window for the Christians to see the sign, obey the command, and get out of there before the real horror began.
You see, this proves the warning wasn't just some vague prophecy. It was a promise you could actually verify. The people who understood the signs, who actually listened to the command, and who endured the tough journey to get out, they were saved, just like the prophecy said they would be.
And let's not forget how incredibly hard this escape would have been. Verses 19 and 20 really drive that home. This wasn't a casual road trip. It was a desperate flight for their lives. The prophecy even calls out how terrible it would be for pregnant women and new moms, and it warns them to pray their flight isn't in the middle of winter or on the Sabbath when travel was so restricted. These were very, very real dangers.
And here it is, the final piece of the puzzle, the historical confirmation. An early church historian named Eusebius actually wrote that before the war got really bad, the Christian community in Jerusalem was warned by a divine oracle. And because of that warning, they all left the city and went to a safe town called Pella. And what was that divine oracle? It seems pretty clear it was this very prophecy, which they didn't treat as a mysterious riddle, but as a life-saving, literal survival guide. And that brings us right back around full circle to verse 13. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. By enduring all of it, the social chaos, the political danger, by reading the signs correctly, and by having the courage to flee, those first-century Christians physically saved their own lives. They fulfilled the promise.
So what does all this show us? It shows just how powerful historical context can be when we're trying to understand Scripture. It really unlocks it. And it leaves us with a pretty big question to think about, doesn't it? If this incredibly detailed prophecy was actually a practical historical roadmap for survival in 70 AD, well, how might that change the way we look at other prophecies that we've always assumed were only about the distant future? Something to think about. Thanks for watching.